Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1.2 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode 343, brought to you by One Planet, we talk about the impact that volunteers can make to our natural landscapes. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the supporters page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Throughout Australia, much of our wilderness areas and reserves are managed by the relevant government agencies, and while they do their best they can with limited resources, they also rely on the support of enthusiastic volunteer groups and individuals to assist, often undertaking work that governments are unable to. In today's episode, we catch up with Jon and Justine from Tasmanian Volunteer group Wilcare SPRATS. Now, SPRATS stands for sPurge Remote Area Teams, SPRATS for short, who for the past 18 seasons have taken on responsibility for managing invasive weed growth on an 850-kilometre section of Tasmania's wild and remote southern and western coastlines, which has seen a 98% reduction in targeted weed species. Jon, Justine, thanks for making the time to chat with us about environmental volunteering.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Before we get started onto SPRATS, give us an overview of your hiking experience.
Okay, well, I did my first major hike in this area as a completely inexperienced 19-year-old. Did a 14-day walk from Cockle Creek across the south coast out to Scotts Peak and somehow actually made it out the other end. And that basically started me. And since then, I think I've walked something like 45 times through the South Coast track, about 20 times around the Southwest Cape Circuit. And then in the early 1990s, I started doing trips on the West Coast between Port Davey and Macquarie Harbour. It's an area, it's a wilderness area with very few or no tracks, very, very few people going there. And we used to go in and do 15-day, 20-day trips, carrying all the stuff with us, including all our food, no food drops. And we used to go in, fly in normally to either a place called Moores Valley and come out through Port Davey, or float plane into one of the little lagoons behind the beach and then come out at Macquarie Heads. And I've done these type of trips pretty much every year except when I haven't been in Tasmania, like, for example, the last year when I've been in Europe. But been doing 4-6 weeks every summer since 1979 in this region.
Sounds like you're a big Tasmanian hiking fan.
Well, it's the best place for it, isn't it?
Now, Justine, what's your background?
My hiking's predominantly been in the southeast of Australia, including Tassie, sort of from Sydney down mainly, a little bit in Europe. I'm in Canberra, so I guess most of my hiking's been in Namadgi and the Budawangs and sort of New South Wales Alps. Yeah, so started hiking as a young teenager and I guess had a little lull when my daughter was younger, but yeah, been hiking most of my life.
Now on to SPRATS and volunteering. How did SPRATS come about?
Well, basically, in the early 2000s, I did a couple of volunteer trips down the west coast and south coast surveying for weeds. Because one of the things I'd noticed over the decades was that tracks come and go, campsites come and go, but the weeds just seem to increase. And in 2001, did a 25-day survey trip where we flew into the west coast north of Low Rocky Point and came out from Melaleuca on the south coast. Also did another one where we went into Hibbs Lagoon and came out at Cape Sorel. So it established that there was a major problem with particularly sPurge, but also marram grass in that part of the coast. Now, in 2005, I was working as a research academic at University of Tasmania under Professor Jamie Kirkpatrick. Now, Jamie Kirkpatrick was on the Parks and Wildlife World Heritage Area Management Committee. And I went to Jamie and said, I want to take 6 weeks off to do a walk down the west and south coasts. And while I'm doing it, I want to do a survey for sPurge and marram grass. What I didn't know was that Jamie on the management committee had been pushing to get a major survey of weeds in that area done. And Jamie snapped back to straight instantly that he'd been hassling to get that done. So he basically got onto Parks and said, you need to support this. Parks gave me a bit of money towards a helicopter to put in food drops, and I headed off with a couple of other people, and 6 weeks later came out at Cockle Creek. Now, it was the first time I'd actually walked from Macquarie Heads through to Cockle Creek in one go. I'd done all of the various sections except for one very small bit in the middle previously, multiple times. But it ended up being the best walk I'd ever done in my life, and I would have been quite happy to turn around and walk back to another 6 weeks back to Macquarie Heads. It was a really awesome trip. While I was away, Jamie had got on to a few other people on the management committee, including Jeff Luscombe, who you've also talked to. And Jeff said that he was part of a group in New South Wales called Willows Out of Wallamai, and they were experienced at doing remote area weeding. So Jeff got a hold of those people involved, and they came down and they did a trial weeding program in that first season. And then from there, they organised for SPRATS to be formed. At that stage, I knew how to survey for weeds, I knew how to control weeds, but I had no idea of how to organise a volunteer group to do it. But these other people from the Willows Out of Wallamai had been doing it for years. And so they basically got SPRATS up and going, and then from then on, the ball's been rolling. We've been going for officially 19 years. We've reduced the amount of sPurge by over 99%. We've still got mop up to do, but we've greatly reduced it. And we've got the marram grass down to fairly low levels as well. We've got it to the stage with both of those weeds where we've still got mop up to do, but they're no longer ecosystem transforming weeds in that area. The other thing it's probably worth mentioning that I probably should have is that area used to effectively be my office. For nearly 20 years, I was the World Heritage Area Fire Management Officer, so working on bushfire management in that area. My PhD was in buttongrass moorland fire management systems, so I used to get out there for work as well. Parks and Wildlife, as an organisation, didn't have the resources to do the on-the-ground remote area management. It's not uncommon for these parks organisations that they get pushed into visitor management, and they have very few resources left over for doing remote area on-the-ground works. And that's where the Willows Out of Wallamai people were so critical, because they'd been doing that for New South Wales Parks and Wildlife for years. And they were able to bring in those skills that the Parks and Wildlife Service here in Tasmania didn't have, and also get lots of other volunteers in. At the peak of SPRATS, we put 72 people out on the summer, over one summer. Now, we no longer do it to that stage anymore, not because we can't get the people, but because we don't need the people. We've reduced the weeds down to a stage where we no longer do standing camps. We do walk-through weeding. And we now have, 25 odd people per summer going out for mostly about 12-day trips. So we've greatly reduced the amount of work we're doing because we've reduced the amount of work that has to be done.
How is the SPRATS program funded? Is it donations from the public? Is it government funding, or a bit of both?
It's a hybrid. What we do, initially, one of our members, Phil Isaacs, was used to doing grant applications. And Phil came into my lounge room, sat down at my table, pulled out his computer, banged away on it, and he said, right, there's a grant application for us, Caring for Country. That was successful, and that gave us the first 3 years of funding. We then had a second Caring for Country grant, which got us another 2 years. And then we've had a series of small just following that. But then changing government federally, grants dried up. We were able to convince the Parks and Wildlife Service that what we were doing was really great value for money. And since then, they've been our nearly exclusive funder. And almost all of our fund money is spent on helicopters. And that's where most of it goes. Our volunteers provide all their own gear, all their own camping gear, I should say, all their own food, and SPRATS only provides a bit of weeding gear, a bit of weeding chemical for the few sites we're still doing marram grass on, and SPRATS provides communication and GPSs and maps. And the volunteers put in a lot of their own resources to come and have their experience out there. But then on the other hand, it's a remote area, wilderness coast, that's extremely hard to access. We provide that access. And we have a model that we call adventure volunteering, where the idea is that you work hard to get the job done, but you also work hard at having a great time. And we find that because our volunteers have such positive experiences, the majority come back year after year after year. And that's part of the reason why we're successful, in that we trained up and experienced a heap of people, and then they come again and again and again.
Now, you look after 850 kilometres of coastline along the southern and western areas of Tasmania. How did you decide this was the area to look after?
It's partly came about because it's an area that is amazing recreationally. And we had a group of people that wanted to protect that area for their own personal reasons. And by combining the environmental work with good recreation, we were able to get people to work there. As regards deciding why there, it's a World Heritage Area. It's an area that should be protected. It's an area that should be in its wild state.
Is the plan to expand from this area, or is this more based around the number of volunteers and funding that's available?
We have had a lot of contact with other groups. In November 2024, SPRATS ran the second volunteer coastal weed management workshop. We ran one in 2010 and then again, as I just said, in 2024, where we got volunteer groups together to share knowledge and experiences. And on the one in November 2024, IRO in Canberra came down to share their information on the new biological control for sPurge, which has recently been developed and approved for release. And now SPRATS has been working closely with CSIRO to do releases of the biocontrol Tasmania-wide. And in fact, this spring, we'll be doing a major release of the biological control for sPurge up the west coast, north of our area that we're currently working in. The reason why we're doing that is that sPurge has seeds that float, and therefore it can reinvade. And the best way to protect the World Heritage Area is to actually stop the seed coming in and invading. And the best way to do that is to hit the sPurge in areas north of our work area. The problem is that a lot of those patches contain millions to tens of millions of plants, and they're completely intractable using the old weed management strategies. And the biocontrol is the only tool that we've got that's practical. The other thing about it is that the cost of doing it is absolutely trivial. I've just put a grant application in to do the spreading, $2,000. Now, it's volunteer work, so there's no labour in that, and that's going to work over about 150 kilometre length of coast. So the costs, now that the biocontrol has been developed, is absolutely trivial. The benefits are massive.
While we're talking about the biological control, what form does it take?
It's a blight fungus that it spreads very easily between sPurge plants, and it initially infects the leaves and then moves to the stem, girdles the stem, greatly reducing the reproductive potential. Now, really interestingly, a couple of days ago, I got back from UK and Europe. In Portugal, Spain, and France, we found sPurge containing what is over there a natural disease, what we call a biocontrol. And if you looked at the sPurge that's growing in southwest Tasmania, and you look at the sPurge that's growing in its native habitat on the Atlantic coast, totally different. The sPurge that as it grows in Tasmania is dense, ecosystem transforming, really healthy. You look at the sPurge on the Atlantic coast and it's really, really unhappy. It's unhealthy. It's sparse and it's infected with this natural disease, which we're now spreading here. And so what I'm hoping is that the biocontrol will not eliminate sPurge because it's highly specific to sPurge. And when it gets going really well, it'll knock the plants back. But then the second thing it'll knock back is itself, because once it's lost its sPurge, it's dead. But what it'll do is reduce the level of sPurge to low levels, unhealthy, low density, where it no longer becomes a ecosystem transforming weed and just becomes just another minor weed on the coast, probably very similar to cackle, which is another, what's that? Sea rocket is the common name. Grows on the coast, but doesn't cause much problem.
Now, from a year-to-year process, how do you work out what your annual work plan is?
Now, because of the combination of a large, remote, hard-to-access coast and climatic reasons, we do our work in early January. It would be completely impractical to do it in June or July. The weather is too bad and the days are too short. So we do it at that time of year. Now, in Western Tasmania, pre the recent major climate change that's been going on in that area, sPurge was taking about 12 to 14 months to mature. So if we weeded it once a year, we could get it before it drops seed, and in doing so, knock it back really effectively. Unfortunately, climate change is here and it's now, and it's making the sPurge mature earlier in the season. When we started SPRATS 19 years ago, very, very few plants, if we missed a plant this season, very, very few of those plants had produced seed before the following January. Now, just a few years later, a lot of them are producing seed in that first year. Now, that's what happens on the east coast of Tasmania, and that's what happens on the mainland, and it wasn't happening that way 19 years ago or even 10 years ago. And so we're probably going to have to rely more on the biocontrol going forwards to help us. And the way we actually decide on our program is we use, well, I know the coast really well. So basically divide it into manageable chunks and put a group in on each of those areas. And because we've been doing it every year, and what I've done is I've actually made a highly detailed route guide, GPS mapped, that shows the route through the scrub, it shows the campsites, and it shows the major weed spots. And what it means is that when people are working their way through, they don't have to think, where am I going to camp tonight? Because they know there's a good campsite at this location with water, and they could just work their way through zone by zone by zone. And it's just because we know the area, we can plan that.
Just to give us an idea of what's involved, take us through a typical weeding event.
I think it varies from different sectors. So I think every year there's a decision made about which sectors should be covered for the year. My involvement was with Sector 3, which is predominantly sand dunes, and I believe that's different to the rest of the sectors. But we have sand dunes that blow back a long way from the beach, and we have to cover all of the dunes to make sure that there's no sPurge or marram grass on those dunes. So it's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of climbing up very steep sand dunes, and it's quite an exertion. So on our sector, we had 3 different base camps, and we were helicoptered into one and then weeded north and south of that, and then after a few days moved to the next base camp and did the same sort of thing. So each day was deciding, the area that we needed to weed for that day and sort of setting off as a group together. And it seems to work better when the team's working, closely. We sort of, I guess our days were sort of spread out because we had to cover so much ground across the sand dunes. So you sort of spread out as you walk, and then, when someone finds a patch of sPurge, we all sort of drop down together and deal with it. And that it very much depends on the maturity of the plant that we find. So the very small plants, the juveniles, as we call them, are, a couple of inches high, 10, 15 centimetres, and they pull out very easily from the sand. Mature plants or multi-year plants that have seeded and had produced juveniles of their own, if you like, can involve quite a lot of digging, in some cases incredible depths, to get the whole of the root out for the plant. So at the time that I was out, we had a 12-day stint and we got nearly 15,000 plants pulled, and we record the number of each of the 3 categories of plants, so juveniles, immature plants that are a bit bigger, and then the multi-year plants that have seeded and produced their own juveniles. Yeah, so it's beautiful countryside to be walking around in, and it's rewarding to find plants and to deal with them and get rid of the weeds from the area. I think the teamwork is the best thing.
When you pull the weeds out, what do you do? Do you just drop them where they are, or do you actually go through and take them out with you?
So in our sector, if you pull out a juvenile plant, you can just drop it where you find it, and it will just die up, just shrivel up in the sun, and not grow any further from there. Plants that had mature seeds on them, we collected the seeds and carried those out with us. Other plants we dug up, and then, sort of depending on the location of wherever we found them, we would make a decision about what to do. In some cases, we would put them on rock so that they can't root, or we would put them under the shade of bigger bushes so that they wouldn't have sunlight to help them germinate or grow from there. Where those sorts of environments weren't available at the time, when we were on big sand dunes, we dug massive holes, and like 1.5 meters, 2 meters deep, and buried them. And then we tried to put those in locations where they could be easily found if they were to then grow for some reason at that depth. And we take GPS measurements from there and keep a record of where that burial site was. My understanding is that we're unsure about whether any of those protocols are successful in making sure the weeds don't grow again. We found some weeds, mature weeds, that had grown right on the top of a very tall sand dune. Or in fact, we found several of those sites. But, you sort of wonder, have these germinated from plants that were left there in a previous year, or, have they blown there? It's very hard to know. But, yeah, I think dealing with the juvenile plants is very easy. Dealing with seeds from the plants is easy, but dealing with bigger plants is a bigger issue, because we don't have the resources or the packs to carry out all the weeds that we're digging up.
Well, what I can probably just add a little bit more on that. Over the years, we've shown that with the immature plants, if you just pull them out and drop them on the dry sand, the chances of them restriking is really minimal. Where we have seed on plants, if you can get it in under mature tea tree, which is the most common form of coastal scrub, I suspect it's a allelopathic effect, because they just don't germinate there. But you need to get it under pretty dense tea tree, which there's a lot of, except in the area that Justine was in, they had 3 beaches which had really extensive blows, so there wasn't close by tea tree. But along most of SPRATS' areas, it's only a few metres to dense tea tree. And so it's really easy to make dumps. And I've GPSed dozens of those and shown that you don't get significant regen in them at all.
That raises the question of, do you see many snakes if you're in underneath bushes?
Snakes, there's a heck of a lot of them on the coast, but they don't eat much. And they're more worried about you than you are about them. And you just, sometimes you go in and, there's a tiger snake. Just stamp your feet a little bit and they've gone.
We only saw 1 or 2 every day.
I've only ever been struck once by a tiger snake in my entire career. And unfortunately, it was in my young days, and I must admit, standing on the other end.
One Planet is an Australian-owned outdoor company dedicated to local manufacturing. Established in 1979, they specialised in lightweight equipment for bushwalking and travel, focusing on backpacks, sleeping bags, tents and apparel. All gear is designed and developed in their Melbourne factory, where most products are also made. From a sustainability perspective, they have a rooftop solar farm which powers the production, and they've also been offsetting carbon waste since 2005. All repairs are handled in-house. One Planet products give you the absolute protection, comfort and freedom in the wilderness that ultimately embodies their commitment to creating the best and most sustainable equipment possible. If you're after a range of Australian designed and made outdoor gear that will stand up to the harshest conditions, whatever the activity may be, then One Planet is the place to go. If people are looking at becoming a volunteer, what sort of skills and abilities do they need?
Outdoor experience and an ability to, and a willingness to basically just get out there, get the job done and have a great time and have all their own gear.
So how long does a typical rotation as a volunteer last when you're down there?
Just over 2 weeks, I suppose. Our sector was 12 days long, and so, there was travel time to get to Tasmania. We, had to go and stay with friends and see our friends in Tasmania, so we add that on, and it's sort of 2.5 weeks. Some of the sectors are longer, so it definitely involves more time, but I think the minimum time is that 12 days. But then you need to add in all the time spent dehydrating food, so you've got it already, and getting all your food drops sorted, and all the logistics, they take some time.
I must admit, as much as I enjoy making dehydrated food, I just don't have the time. I'd rather spend the money and use my time on other things.
With me, I'm mostly a geriatric bludger these days, and I spend maybe 3 months a year on SPRATS, but then I'm doing the rollout and the research on the biocontrol as well.
Justine, as a volunteer, why do you take part and what do you get out of the volunteer program?
I took part in it because it sounded like something that's worthwhile doing. Jon maybe mentioned it, but, we're not only pulling out weeds, but we're doing research on and trying to protect the habitat for the shorebirds that are down there. I think what SPRATS has been doing for the last 19 years is very commendable. And I think having had years of hiking experience, you sort of, it's nice to be able to pay back some of the time that you get to spend in nature and to do things like that. I've been involved in, land care projects, sort of propagating plants and digging them into the ground and things like that. So this was completely the opposite to pulling plants out of the ground, but definitely worthwhile. I think it's important to be preserving our natural habitats, and a World Heritage Area is a perfect place to be working.
Now, from a day-to-day perspective, provide a brief overview of what a typical day looks like on an average trip.
It did depend on the day and the area that we were weeding. There was a planned rest day in our 12 days, but we took that over 2 half days instead, just because where we were and the weather was conducive to having swims and going fishing and various things like that. So typically we would get up in the morning. If we were staying at the base camp where we were and not moving from there, we would just get up, have breakfast, get our gear all organised and set off for the day. So we would take food that we needed for the day, so morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, and set off. And then as you come across weed sites, sit and pull out weeds, sometimes for several hours, sometimes for 5 minutes. It just depended on the site, the number of plants, and just move along the coastline as you go. The area where obviously a lot of beach work walking and a lot of dune climbing, so it's quite exertive work. Digging out the larger plants uses a lot of effort. But I think in other sectors that, the people are walking through the area, so they're carrying their packs and stopping to weed at sites when they need to, and continue on with their packs, whereas we were able to leave our packs obviously at our base camp and not having to carry those, which was nice for my first ever at SPRATS, and not have to carry a pack and sort of weed at the same time. So we kind of had different roles in our group. My role particularly was the note keeper, so during the day we would keep a record of all the shorebirds that we saw, or all the birds that are coming into the beach, and also land birds and cockatoos and whatnot. So we keep a record of all of those. We keep a record of all the plants we see, the animals that we see, and tracks, particularly on the beach, like from animals, as well as a count of all the weeds that we've pulled up and the locations that we've found them at. We had one of the fellows in my group was pretty handy with a spray bottle and good at weeding, and he seemed to enjoy that sort of role. So he sort of took on the most of the work of dealing with the marram grass, which is very difficult to dig out, and we needed to spray. Yeah, it's just, I think a typical day varies greatly depending on the terrain and the team, I suppose. We figure it out as you go.
So how did you move from camp to camp? Were you helicoptered or were you walking?
No, so we walked. So we got helicoptered into the first base camp and then walked between. And then on the final day, we were picked up by boat from Bathurst Harbour and taken back to Strahan, where we started.
Now, given this program has been running for 18 seasons, do you have any interesting or memorable trips? If so, why?
Well, if you're going to ask me, I would say the end-for-end survey trip, where 6 weeks going right through, was the most memorable. But then I've had repeated ones. I think I only had one trip that wasn't really, really amazing, and that was for completely non-SPRATS reasons. Basically, I had to be pulled out because of my mother getting really ill. That's the only one that hasn't been really memorable. It's just the being able to spend several weeks out on that coast. I do a lot of snorkeling in my off time, and just be able to get out there, make a difference. I do a lot of recording of particularly vegetation dynamics out there, because I've been a fire researcher for pretty much my entire career. I've actually kept going on some of the research sites I set up when I worked for Parks and Wildlife, just monitoring them with longitudinal studies. So just doing that combination of doing the weeding, getting it done, recording bird life, animal life, plant, and just sitting down in the evening and watching the sun go down. And one of the major things that we've done over the years is put a lot of effort into finding good campsites so that you can do that. Not so much in Justine's sector, but in the others, where you're walking through, being able to know, right, in an hour's time, I've got a good place to stop. I can just concentrate on getting the weeding done. Don't need to worry about where I'm going to camp because I know there's a good spot.
And what about you, Justine?
Oh, we had an absolutely incredible sunset on one of the days. Obviously on the west coast, the sun's setting over the ocean, but one of the days, I think it was the 7th of January, was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And we all climbed up out our camp, which was behind the dunes in a lagoon, and came and sat up on the dunes looking down over the beach. So you're sitting in the warm sand and the sun's going down in front of you, and, seagulls are flying, and it was just incredible. So definitely the highlight of the whole trip. It was amazing.
If our listeners want to help SPRATS or get involved, where can they get more information, or who can they contact?
Well, SPRATS is a member of Wilcare Tas, and if people send an email to the SPRATS Gmail account, which is sprats.tas@gmail.com, if they send an email to that, they'll get put on the mailing list. And one of the things that SPRATS has been really, really strong on is putting information out to our volunteers. So at the end of each season, we write a proper summary of what we've got done, how the program's going, and what we're planning for the next year, which reminds me I've got to start doing that in the next few days. And then in the middle of the year, we send out what we call our Sprat Pack, which gives detailed information on the next season's objectives and dates and number of people required, and people then apply. And then the next stage is that once people have been selected and put into groups, we send out detailed briefing notes so that people know exactly what to expect and what to bring. And I also emphasise that SPRATS is a open, inclusive group. We welcome new ideas, new people, new initiatives as much as we can. And so if somebody comes in and wants to be involved, they'll be rated exactly as their experience and as much as we can use them.
And if people want to support you financially?
We haven't actually set up that program yet because basically we haven't had to. And it may be something that we've got to do in the future, but at the moment, Parks and Wildlife has been covering our major costs, and then volunteers are covering their own personal gear and food and so forth. And volunteers need to get themselves to Strahan, which is also a significant donation.
Now, if people want this contact information, if they go to the podcast show notes for this episode, I'll have some contact details on there for you. One final question, where to next for SPRAT over the next couple of years?
2 main programs. First of all, it's a continuation of the the SPRATS work in the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area and its northern buffer, with the sectors going out each January and continuing the mop-up of the weeds. Over the last few years, SPRATS has been very heavily involved in the rollout in Tasmania of the recently developed CSIRO biological control. And we're gearing up to do a lot more of that this coming spring. And that's trying to reduce the threat of reinvasion by reducing the health and reproductive potential of sPurge outside our traditional work area. Because, quite honestly, what we're doing in the very long term is not sustainable. We can't continue to put people out on the coast every summer forever. We've got to basically, the biocontrol is going to be the saviour there, I hope. But what SPRATS has done before the biocontrol gets going is we've purchased time. What we've done is reduce the major impacts down to very low levels so that the biocontrol can now come in and hopefully hold the line for us.
So we've been talking with Jon and Justine from Wilcare SPRATS. Thanks very much for filling us in on this very interesting program and all the great work that you're doing for the natural environment in Tasmania.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, well, thank you. Let us know how it goes.
So that was our interview with volunteer group Wilcare SPRATS, who do a lot of really good work in southern and western Tasmania. We've previously done a podcast on volunteering in relation to trail maintenance and trail and friends of trails. And this was just something just a bit different. For an area that's not commonly accessed by mainstream hikers, and listening to Jon's story where he spent 6 weeks going across this area, it really was an area it's remote, it's a bit out of the place, and it's not until you walk through there and realise what the conditions with the weed growth when Jon first started this sort of 18, 19, 20 years ago, that you realise the impact and the damage that's being done by imported weeds and pests. Had they have not done this, it probably would have destroyed a lot of the environment, and by the time we realised, it probably would have been too late. So, as Jon said, they have been doing this for just on 19 seasons now, and he said that this is not something that's sustainable where you can't keep on sending people down every year. But what they have done by doing this program is managing to keep it under control. They've reduced the sPurge back by, in the area they're looking after, by about 98%. But if they were to disappear for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, the numbers would just explode again. So as he said, the next step is the release of the biocontrol, and that will be a longer term, more permanent sort of fix to the problem. And I don't think they'll ever totally get rid of the weed, but as he said, it'll be reduced to a point where it's not an environment-changing pest. It's just another minor weed that's not having a major impact. One of the things I find with volunteer groups, it's the sort of thing that when you've got 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, however long it is for holidays each year, I think the whole idea of the environmental sort of holidays where you help give back to the environment is a good thing. It's not something that all of us tend to want to do, but it's as if enough people go through and do this, it can have a big impact and it can help the environment for the rest of us, that we get the benefit from it. Jon was saying they aren't actively chasing funding from general public because a lot of that's being dealt with by government agencies who realise the importance of this and the minimal costing that it actually impacts. And the people who are taking part, the volunteers, they're getting themselves down there, they're providing their food, and then they're doing the work all on their own without being recompensed for it. And listening to Justine, she said the benefits of this are really good. And you may not do this every year, certainly Jon is, but you might only do it every year or every second year. And I'm sure they'd appreciate additional volunteers coming through and helping out. And as I mentioned previously, if you go to the show notes for episode 343 of the Australian Hiker podcast, we'll have contact information if you want to find out more about what's going on. We hope you've enjoyed this interesting program on environmental volunteering. I certainly did, and it's something I'll be keen to see how the biocontrol progresses over the next couple of years. That's all for this episode, brought to you by One Planet. We hope you've enjoyed. That's all for me. Bye for now.